All right, why don't we wait for Bill to get set? And Rosie, you see what Jeannie's prepared up there for you?
For the record.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I can start, or you want to open the meeting? Go ahead.
All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the December the 19th Camden Planning Board meeting. First of all, do we have any public comments on non-agenda items? Seeing none, Jeremy wanted to start. You want to start by?
Yeah, I just wanted to establish where we were, left off after the last meeting.
Okay.
Corey Hill, Anderson Inn folks came in to do a little pre-app on some proposed parking changes. We went over a handful of items, and maybe I'll share those right now, about adding a statement on stormwater to the plan, or to their application, lighting, about being full cutoff, buffering parking areas where possible, adding a crosswalk to the plan, and provide as-built conditions on the plan, and then providing a note that their changes will comply with Maine site law. And so now before you is an amendment to the approved site plan. And then what we're going to have to do is you're going to have to go through the approval criteria and determine whether or not they meet those. I think there's 1 through 9 on the approval criteria in section 6, I believe it is, of the ordinance.
Okay, which we've also got a copy of here.
Correct.
Okay.
Bill, do you want to go on from there?
So good evening, I'm Bill Latham, University Engineering. And thanks for your time this evening. As Jeremy outlined, we're going to present you a pre-app project and subsequently submit a package for your review as amendment to the site plan. And included in that, according to Jeremy's list, I believe we've got stormwater and a narrative analysis. We'll provide an interest to the board, I believe, a lighting cut sheet for the proposed light to be furnished to their one light, and you may recall it's going to get moved, and then a new light is going to be added to improve the local lighting around the walk. Subsequent to our meeting, we got some design input and additionally revised our design input, particularly in regard to the parking lot in the southwest portion of the property. And we looked at all configurations having parking to the right or the parking to the left. As it worked out, and as we walked through with Rick and Jeremy, myself, we thought that as originally proposed with a access aisle, we provided 24 feet wide, so that's got parking and then parking to the right is the safest configuration there. We are proposing tree planting adjacent to that parking area on both sides, and additionally on the easterly side, we're proposing just a short green fence, so it'd be a solid.
Which is the parking to the rear of the building.
Yeah, in that little corner there.
Yep. And when Bill referred to, he walked the site, I walked the site with, it was Dave St. Laurent and I walked the site with Bill.
Yeah, Dave was-
You mentioned Rick.
Yeah, well, Rick was there as well.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, he was, you're right, sorry.
And did want to point out that we are proposing a staff-only sign adjacent to that drive, so simply beyond the ambulance point, the intended use for that single lane access is for staff, and then there is a propane farm, tank farm behind there, so that's the one delivery that typically occurs in there. But given that staff designation, I think that's an appropriate use for that parking area. As Jeremy had indicated, he had recommended a crosswalk be provided along Community Drive. We've indicated that on the plan. And in addition, after consulting with Jeremy and again with Chief Farley, we've annotated or intended to place some yield pedestrian signs in the middle of the crosswalk area. Those are those semi-portable signs that are able to be moved so the plowing and operations can occur.
Seasonal?
Yeah, I would expect that, depending on how the plowing event occurs, it might be removed seasonally or.
I would prefer that they be there and not seasonally.
Side or something?
I mean, they'll move them when they're plowing the road. Once the road's clear, I think they need to get back in there. I mean, the fire chief was pretty concerned about slowing traffic down in that area, especially where we got new cars that are perpendicular to the drive. And he was just concerned about if something happened, how to get back into that site, because there's no alternative site, second means of into the property for him. So he really wanted the site, just traffic to be calm the best way possible. We were talking about speed bumps, but I know that is a pain. So if we can do these signs that will stay there, I'd recommend one up close at the crosswalk at Quarry Hill too, if you don't mind, at the drive. Okay.
In the summer, you guys usually have the little kid, the flag, yeah.
Yeah, there's some regular standard ones that are along that line.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just, a couple. You don't mind sharing?
Sure, happily. Thank you for shares.
I would further note, for information purposes, that there are 10-mile-an-hour speed limit signs on that section of Community Drive as well.
And I guess, Board, it's up to you, I think, to ask questions. I think Bill described the project quite well.
Do we want to go through to make sure that who's here and before we start asking too many more questions? Do we want to just make sure that who's here and voting and go through that
Sure.
before we?
Yep.
Yeah, given
Yep.
that we've dove in. Richard is going to be sitting as a voting member for the record tonight. So we've got Richard Bernhardt. We've got Even Shaw, Rosie Curtis,
Jeff Senders.
Mark Siegensal.
Good.
So we have enough for a quorum. Do any members have any bias or conflict of interest in this project? No? Have any members been contacted by a member of the public? Or does anybody have any information about the site that needs to be shared? No? Okay. So therefore, can we make a finding that the applicant has standing to apply? Can I make a motion that that the applicant does have standing to apply? All those in favour? Aye, so that's 5-0, unanimous. Jeff seconded it. Okay, do we need to get any more specific than that?
No, I think that's good right now. I think what you need to do now is ask questions of the applicant. I mean, there is no public hearing on this, but you will have the opportunity to take some questions or comments from the public as well.
Okay, so maybe just to be clear that what we're reviewing is the site plan application, the packet that was dated December the 9th, 2019, and revised plan C1 that was dated 12/16/2019.
And supporting documentation.
Okay, and supporting documentation. So do we have any questions from the board at this point? about the
What, overall
project?
questions or on
Yeah.
specifics?
Well, I guess I need to speak first on this. I mean,
Yeah.
just to clear everything and notify you that I did drive up through here, and I looked at parking in this area here, and I stopped and asked a question about this, so just to be.
Okay.
Can you divulge what question you asked and what your
Well,
answer was, just so the board's coming from the same place you are?
Well, I just asked that they look at parking along the roadway here, in the southeast corner of the building.
Over by that landscaped area?
Yeah.
Sidewalked area?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I suggested maybe they move that fence back a little bit and put parking in there, and just for full disclosure, that's.
All right.
And I spoke with the commissioner when we discussed that. Presently, there is parallel parking adjacent to that fence. But to create 90-degree parking, we would have to have travel way behind it widened to the 24 feet the ordinance requires, as well as the depth of the parking area. So it worked out that the fence would actually be really encroaching beyond the existing footpath that's inside that fenced in outdoor space for the residents.
Oh, this is where we are?
So it was a concern that they thought they could lose that space for
Over here.
the residents.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
All right. So back to your, I mean, I think this is the time for any questions you might have about the project.
Are we going to go through these number
We
by
do,
number?
do you want to do that? Yes, there's
Yeah.
nothing. Okay.
Do we do any public comment on this, or no?
Do we want to have
Yeah,
public
I- we
comments
have
or
somebody that wants to
questions
comment.
now, or do we want to go through the approval criteria first?
I
Questions
think the
now?
comments first, yeah.
I think taking the comments first, and then you should consider whether this is an amendment, and we kind of already decided it was going to be last meeting, but then look at, that we have to, just mention that we have to review this against the approval criteria.
Yep.
Okay.
So, and you've reduced the number of parking spaces from the initial proposal?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct. It's down to 29 proposed.
What was it last, 2 weeks ago?
35?
35?
Okay.
Oh, so you.
Where exactly
Where
did
did
you
you take
lose
those
them?
out?
Just to be clarified.
Actually, some of it is reduction in the parking spaces to the southwest, and then in addition, we're actually utilizing an area along Community Drive that has 4 parallel parking spaces, and that wasn't accounted for when we represented that there were 35 new spaces. The net aggregate new spaces is 29.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So just to make sure I understand, you're losing 4, but gaining 20.
Or something new, 33 new.
Okay.
Okay. So at this point, I would ask if there's anybody from the public who wants to comment Can I ask you to come forward, and do we have a mic? I'll pass the mic back and just state your name for the record. We need anybody to write their name down, Jeannie?
Well, that's okay. I just don't know how Janice can catch her on the cameras, which is why they usually go over. I don't need to be on camera. No choice. My name is Deb Dodge, and I live at 6 Arbor Way, which is in the Quarry Hill community.
There's no microphone over there.
Oh, so I-
take that with you or
so you'll be-
stand right next to me.
Well, you'll be speechless.
All right. I'll get a mic if I need it.
Good evening. Thanks for taking some public comment and question. I appreciate it. This is as much for Bill and Rick as you guys. I've been looking at the plans, and the parking area you really haven't talked about are the first 6 spaces when you come into Community Drive. I went out there and I've looked at them, and I took some pictures and I did some measuring, and if it's okay, I'd like to pass a picture around to you guys. And pardon me, what you're looking at is, that's the entrance. If you look at your plan, and you can see a crosswalk, a sidewalk and a crosswalk right sort of close to the opening of Community Hill Drive. And the picture I'm showing you is of the elevation in that area where there's a large rock and a bush and shrubs. And if you flip it over, Ethan, you can see the screening that exists between sort of that rise and the entrance to Community Drive and the employee parking that already exists. And when I looked at the measurements, it looks like that first space of the 6 when you're coming off of Community Drive will be right about where that rock is. So it looks like the elevation and some of that screening will have to be 86th in order to put in those 6 spaces that are 19 feet deep. But the plan doesn't show that, and doesn't show, I guess I should be doing this. It's these spaces. It doesn't show whether you're doing any replanting and how much of that screening between the employee lot and that entrance area is going away. I know that they're 19 feet deep, so I'm not so worried about how close they are to the edge of the road. What I'm worried about and concerned about is reducing that elevation, which provides a more aesthetically pleasing entrance into Community Drive. The rock and the screening behind it, there's a tree that appears that will need to be removed. You can see it in my picture. If you're looking at that picture and you go to the right of the rock, you can see a tree there, and there doesn't seem to be any indication about what's being removed as far as screening and what may be replaced if screening is going to be gone.
Okay.
It's maybe considered just an aesthetic thing, but I'm not so, I don't know how much is going away, and if that is mostly going away, I'm not so sure it's worth the 6 spaces. Somebody who lives there and drives by and walks there all the time, that provides a really nice soft opening into that large driveway. And I'm concerned about the loss of the elevation and the screening. So maybe you can answer.
Yep, there is definitely regrading, and to the south of those new spaces, there is an indication, directly to the south, this is an indication of new grading that'll have to happen, that'll
Right.
take some of that berm elevation down, but create a cut slope between the new spaces and the employee parking area. There will still be that mounted landform, that constructed berm, and that will be replanted.
That will be. And so the tree you'll just lose that tree, but this area back here, whatever you have to take away, will be replanted?
The intent is to plant shrubbery there as well.
And how much elevation are you losing there?
The top of it is really not cut off, it's just the
Approach to it?
The mass of it is reduced by having a new flat area and a cut slope.
I believe I'm looking at topo lines here, right? So 163, 164, 165. So that's pretty much what it is now? Just a
We're
little bit steeper?
shaving it, and the side adjacent to the parking area is going to be all stabilized, graded at 1-on-3, and there's an opportunity for
Did
planting.
you get a chance to see Deb's picture?
Probably knows it very
I
well.
pass it, but I'm just curious if the majority of that screening, that it does screen the parking lot behind. I'm just curious whether that will,
Right, and you can
they'll
see,
provide about as much, or will it, whether it be?
Yeah, I don't know how much of that's going away. I mean, that's obviously going away.
Right.
That'll go away.
right,
And
we'd be moving the rock and utilizing that in that back cut slope area as well, and that tree is going to be removed, and there'll be some more lower level shrub planting proposed to separate that employee parking area.
Do you need a,
So, that tall tree is not really providing a visual divide.
No, yeah, I was getting more towards the mound itself and
Yeah.
how much it screens the cars. Is that gonna,
Right.
is it gonna be basically that same
Right,
height of
the
screening?
top of the mound will be sustained, it'll just be not as large, it's just cutting into the bank, but maintaining the back
And
slope.
perhaps it could be enhanced with like the plantings on
Leading
top.
edge on that 3-to-1 cut slope, there's going to be opportunity to plant that screening.
you don't need a retaining wall?
No.
On the other side of where the cars are going to be?
Correct. We wouldn't need a retaining wall. It's just take that, it's a rise in the landform, and we're
Right.
just going to come in level and then allow it to reach that same elevation with a sharper slope.
Since there isn't anything on the plan saying that there will be screening and plantings replaced, is it possible to request that that be part of, sort of the approval that, yes, this will work if you will, replace as much screening as possible or whatever in order to make sure if it's not on the plan, it doesn't have to.
I believe we can
it
put
doesn't have to
conditions on
happen
there.
If it's not on the plan.
I believe we can put conditions on there if it's the will of the board. Yeah. Thanks, Deb.
Deb. Oh, can Jeremy have his microphone back, please? We can't cut him off for too long. He's been very good.
Yeah, can we have a copy of that for the record?
And the only thing that she gave me,
I think it was just
Oh,
that.
it was just the one two-sided picture.
the sign.
Oh, that was something from the
Yeah.
applicant.
Yeah, here.
Yeah.
Bill, can I just ask, I had talked to you about possibly a mirror on that back wall. Do you think that's needed anymore since we moved the drive further back away from the corner? When we walked out on the site, there was another plan. This is a revised plan. The other plan that we had midweek or earlier in the week had that rear southwest parking lot switched over, inversed. And the driveway in was really close to that corner, which is right at the bend in the road. So at that point, I asked for a mirror to be mounted on the wall so people coming out can see people coming around the bend, around the corner. Do you think that's needed at this point?
I'm not sure it's needed, but
Okay.
we,
I mean, I don't want you to do something that's not needed, but if at some point it becomes an issue, we ought to, okay.
Do we have any other comments or questions from the public about this project? No? Okay, gentlemen, should we go through the site plan approval criteria?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, can I ask one other comment? I was going through the list of things that we had asked for last time, and I know you provided a cut sheet, but all for the lighting, but all that the cut sheet was that I saw was the actual bulb.
right. So the intent is to use that same fixture that's there all along Corey Hill Drive. and
Okay,
on the
I just want to make
approach
sure it will be is a full cutoff.
It is that same fixture, and this
Okay.
is a bulb-to-bulb replacement. The
Is the bulb going to hang below the shield? Oh,
yeah, this
It's
is
a
a
glass
okay.
globe.
glass globe. Right. So the bulb is higher, and the glass globe is lower.
okay.
That's my
But
understanding.
is the existing fixture a full cut-off and dark sky compatible?
It's the same as what we've been using.
So it's a match, yeah.
Just verifying that it already is. Okay, so does that... That was the same question I had, Jeremy. I'm seeing a bulb, I'm not seeing a dark sky fixture, so that doesn't,
That was-
that doesn't show me anything that I care about in terms of dark sky
Correct.
lighting, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you can make a motion or include in your motion when you get to that point that it'll be a full cutoff, regardless of whether or not it's existing or not, it'll be a full cutoff. That's my,
Yeah. Okay. Can we start going through these? So just to be clear, what we're considering is whether this proposal can be reviewed as an amendment by reviewing the application against the approval criteria of Article 10 to determine if the proposed changes have any impact on the criteria. So we're going to move through those now. Should I read them out, Jeannie? Do I need?
It's up to you. You can look at the question. This is attached to each number. And ask yourself that question first, and if there is no change, then there's no reason to
Go through it.
elaborate. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, is there any, so maybe that's the question, is there any landscaping existing or proposed involved with this proposal?
Yes.
That's what we were
Gentlemen?
just discussing.
Yes. Yes, so the goal in number 1 is to preserve and enhance the landscape by minimising tree removal, disturbance of soil and retaining existing vegetation during construction. And after construction is complete, landscaping shall be designed and planted to define, soften or screen the appearance of off-street parking areas from the public right-of-way and abutting properties and or structures to minimise the encroachment of the proposed use on neighbouring land uses. Has the applicant done that to our satisfaction?
I think on the southwest lot, you have provided a good buffer as we asked. I think that'll be fine. And then on Community Drive, I was just taking that in faith that you're going to maintain good landscaping, because you always have. And that if one of these spaces takes that rock in the entrance, you'll just kind of move it down.
I tend to agree with Jeff. I'm prepared to make a motion on this one if you guys are, unless there's more discussion with the board.
I have something to say.
Yep.
And I don't agree with you. The way I'm reading that title, preserve and enhance the landscape, I'm looking at landscape in a little broader terms than number of trees removed. And I couldn't in good conscience raise my hand and vote saying that this plan is enhancing the landscape. My feeling is that you've done a great job technically with this, but the overall effect of it is, I think in some ways rather catastrophic, because we're burying this building in a sea of cars and parking places. I think that there was an effort made when the building was designed to make it somewhat residential in scale with the way that it's articulated and some of the fenestration, and it's not now it's been smothered by cars. I drove down Quarry Hill Road, and I didn't feel like I was invading the property, even though it says private way. I go that way to the dump all the time, and I and I looked down Community Drive. It had been plowed, and because it had been plowed, and there are cars parked along the side of the road where I think technically they're not supposed to be right now, it gave me an idea of the amount of vehicles that's going to be in there. And it's so filled now that, as I pointed out to your executive person last week, I don't see where you're going to add any more cars in the future when your programs get expanded, unless you're really creative and approach like the neighboring property, the Cook House, if you could sort of share a driveway, a staff driveway in there. And then in this little part over here on the southwest corner, I'm sort of concerned about those 8 parking spaces. I know you need them, but what it does to occupants of those apartments down there is pretty deleterious. I mean, they're older people living in there now, looking out at what appears to be some pretty nice trees from what I saw from an aerial shot, and now it's going to be looking at 8 cars. I just think it's not sensitive, accepting that the fact that you did very well by fitting these cars in. I just, in good conscience, I could not say that this is improving the landscape. So I just wanted to go on record.
Okay, and I hear your concerns, Richard. I would say that it's not necessarily, the way I read it, that you're supposed to improve. I mean, obviously, that's a goal. But it does say that you minimize tree removal and disturbance of soil and retain existing vegetation as much as possible, and landscaping shall be designed and planted to define, soften, or screen the appearance of off-street parking areas. So, yeah, the title is preserve and enhance the landscape, but I'm not sure that that's what actually is required of the project. But, we've talked about the possibility of different locations for parking, and it sounds like they've explored just about every option except maybe off-site in a shuttle bus. And if that's a recommendation, and you're going to turn down these 29 spaces, that might be something they would have to do, or else they have to go underground with their parking. So I would put conditions, sensitive to our comments from Deb Dodge, and the way that one parking lot seems to be screened by the mound, and I would be happy to put conditions on that and the representations of the applicant. But if we're going to allow additional parking here, I don't see how we can do it in a way that's any more sensitive to the landscaping.
And just to bring us back to where we were last time, I don't think there was any plan for any landscaping in the pre-app meeting of that southwest parking lot.
Right.
And
That
now
was
they're
added.
proposing use 6 feet on center on both sides of that parking lot to try to break it up. I'm just throwing that out there. This is that southwest one behind the back of the building.
Solid fence would be key right there. So
Mud fence is there.
Well, both. I thought, both are.
Richard was specifically talking about the one in the rear, and
I mean, and Richard's right insofar as that looks like it's a fairly nice green space that we're losing. I mean, that's a reality of the project.
yeah,
It
I
isn't-
will kind of acknowledge that.
If you want to say, well, you can have your number of parking spaces over here, but you can't have the 8 there to preserve that green space, that's certainly something you can propose and the board can discuss. But if we're talking about the parking spaces that they are asking for.
I would also add just some of these criteria. I mean, you read this, and this is as if this is a brand-new site development happening on a piece of, undisturbed land. And that's not what we're reviewing.
Shoehorning an amendment in here.
We are.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing that out there because it talks about preserving in its natural state. What we have out there is not in its natural state. What we have out there is a project that came for site development plan approval years and years and years
Already
ago.
did that.
And already did that, and now we have existing landscaping. Some of it's going away, and that was landscaping that was proposed and added over time. I'm sure some was added over time. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, it's hard to,
Yeah.
I mean, I totally get what Richard's saying, but it's hard to read this coming from this, that this, as if this is a brand-new site. It's not a brand-new site. It's not natural conditions. Just
Had you
throwing
thought
that out
about
there.
any other ways to, as either Jeremy, is it to shoehorn more cars in here to alleviate these spaces that are?
Well, I think for the inn, based on the amount of land that's reserved for the inn's use by the property owner, we really have to focus, starting at the intersection of Quarry Hill Road and Community Drive, and proceed in. We have looked in past, and it would take land acquisition, add alternatives to land that Quarry Hill does not own at this point, just not economically feasible to reach out and acquire land from the McGonagall House, which would be.
There's some land on Colquitt Avenue that's for sale that would make a decent parking lot.
You have to do a traffic study on that one.
I do think we need
There'd be a lot of traffic going
be-
down
it
there.
would be
in the interest
would
of
be a
getting out
shuttle.
of here, gentlemen, in 2 hours, I do want to keep things focused on what we're talking about. And just in response to your comments, I think it's not our job to hypothesize about future staffing requirements that may or not be allowed at some point in the future, which is some of your concerns about the amount of parking. And I don't think that's for us it's not our purview, and we don't have the skill set to do that. So that's one of my comments. Another of my comments is that when we read this, it's talking about the landscaping that should be put back. It says here it should be designed and planted to define, soften or screen the appearance of off-street parking areas from the public right-of-way and abutting properties and or structures. So it's not talking about what happens within the property itself, according to this amendment. So whether or not we think it's a good idea for you to have a parking space right next to that building, it doesn't address this. It does address whether there's screening that screens neighbouring properties, right? So I just want to be clear about...
The only public right-of-ways would be Elm Street and Union Street.
So I'm just saying that, to me, when I look at that, that's the only thing that we should be addressing.
The reading of it is accurate, though. It does not talk about within the property itself.
So that would be my comment, just about whether or not we think that should happen. That's not our job as a planning board to be commenting on that.
I think that's a fair read, but we were just trying to be more cooperative.
And I appreciate the fact that we've been through this once and you've made adjustments based on some of our concerns last time round.
And we appreciate you agreeing to a condition of this approval that will have some landscaping between that lot, the new small lot up front, up by Community Drive and Quarry Hill, right?
Which again
So you do a
speaks to
motion,
Deb's
then?
comments. I think if Mark's, do you have any comments about the first?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm prepared to make a motion then, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I would move that the number one, preserve and enhance the landscape, that the applicant has met the criteria of this section on the condition, the representations of the applicant, that they've added the screening on the small southwest lot here as indicated on the plans, and that they will maintain the elevation and additional screening perhaps over there on the other Community Drive, the 8 parking spaces between that and the larger lot, to address the concerns of Deb Dodge and others who have raised it on the board. And with those conditions, I move that we find this first criteria satisfied.
Boy, how do you second
Jeannie?
anything that long?
I lost track.
Hold on. Just let Jeannie keep writing. Do we have a second?
Mark
Do you
second.
need them to read it back? It wasn't that bad, was it?
Oh, yeah. You're definitely a lawyer, honey.
That they've met the criteria based on
With a condition.
with the condition that based on the representation of the applicant and the fact that they've added screening to the small southwest lot and will add back the elevation and replace the screening removed at the corner of Quarry Hill Drive and Community Drive.
Between the parking lots at Quarry Hill and Community Drive. Yeah.
Does that all make sense? Does that?
Between the 8 spaces and the
Correct.
30-ish
Correct.
spaces that are there now. Yeah.
On the path there.
You'll just get some landscaping and get some
Planting on
grade
the
there.
north side of that cut slope.
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Good. Vote.
Do we have a second?
Yeah, Mark seconded it.
Mark seconded it. All those, you ready?
Discussion.
Do we have any discussion? Okay, all those in favour?
Well, let's
Okay, you do want some discussion.
Let's go to discussion here, okay? I don't think that amendment or that proposal really touches on how it what am I trying to say? How it speaks to issue 1. All right, I think the reality is that it's private property and it's not affecting other properties, as we discussed. So that's why basically number 1 doesn't apply.
That landscaping wasn't on the approved
Any
site plan.
sense? I mean,
Well, I mean, we're shoehorning, again, there's the code we've talked about, Jeremy has represented, that could be improved as far as addressing how an amendment to a site plan is handled, right? So we're dealing with what we have, and it's somewhat up to the board to balance the amendment to the plan with the original site plan itself. And so what we're trying to do is do that. And so I think it's fair to read this language as it applies, both as it would originally have applied and then as an amendment to that plan. Does that make sense? Because they're not coming in and doing a new site plan review here. They're doing an amendment to an existing plan. And there's nothing really in the code that walks us through that procedure. So we're left to sort of our own resources to try to take what is an original site plan review criteria and apply it to what would be an amendment. And I think that we're trying to balance those two.
And I think what your initial motion said was that that you are, in essence, preserving and enhancing the landscape. I mean, that's how I read what how you stated it.
Yeah.
And you just threw in the added condition that they're going to add some landscaping.
It wasn't on the plan here.
That wasn't on the plan there.
Correct.
So how do you feel that pertains to the public right-of-way and abutting properties?
Well, I think Rosie addressed it. It doesn't really, but so you're saying we shouldn't put any conditions on it?
That's what I was getting at, is that because this should pertain to public right-of-ways and abutting properties, that's why it doesn't pertain. I mean, we should, yes, we should acknowledge the conditions on it, but
Well, where would you have us do that? I mean, you're right, we could just say this doesn't apply and that they don't have to do any landscaping. Is that your preference?
But this is the section to put it in.
If we're going to get it in there, this is where it goes.
Right.
So if it's,
I mean,
So if we said it doesn't apply because of that paragraph, but we acknowledge the applicant's commitment.
Willingness to address concerns of neighbors.
I mean, I'm happy to have a new motion. Apparently mine was too long-winded anyway.
way too long-winded. I mean, my argument for mentioning that, I would say, I would think it legitimate to say something about the re-landscaping you've offered to do in the front at the north, because that is next to the public right-of-way. And that
It's not really.
could be seen. It's not.
Quarry Hill Road is not a
Okay,
public
all
right-of-way,
right,
technically. I mean,
Okay.
Do what they want.
Okay, so I'm kind of with Mark on that one then.
We're going to landscape that.
We understand that. I think we're just trying to get through the
We're amenable.
Minutia.
minutia of what a
Find way
code
to get
says.
it in and
Exactly.
keep moving through and, yeah.
No matter where it is, parking area, the size of the
Right, but
big one down low.
that is all, I mean, we're having to buffer it from abutting properties, and it's all already met.
Within the standards, though, there are buffering requirements for parking lots with over 20 spaces, right? There's screening.
Right, but we're not reviewing any parking slots that are over 20 acres, or 20 spaces.
But, well, the one that is existing,
That was already permitted, we're not
Right.
reviewing
and
that.
then we're saying not to remove the buffer for that, is all.
But I think what we're saying is that bank will not go away.
Right.
So
The
that
berm
will
won't
remain
go away.
screened.
Right, the backside of the berm won't be
So-
touched.
No change.
So I think we need to acknowledge that fact, that will not change, and that
Landscaped
it will be landscaped,
in a similar condition that it is currently.
yes.
What Ethan had said was the height of it won't change, which is what will happen. It won't change and it'll be landscape back there. The front of it, like you said, will be cut down to allow for the back of the car to be there.
So the mass of it will be reduced. I think everybody's on the same page.
Could you suggest a way to, how would you feel comfortable having that motion written?
In the motion? An amended motion?
How would you word that?
I mean, you could do something like that.
Under paragraph 1, preserve and enhance the landscaping. Does not pertain 2, it does not affect public right-of-way or abutting properties. However, the applicant has agreed to maintain the berm and maintain proper landscaping, screening.
Would that, people
I
be
second that.
comfortable with that?
In that too.
I have no issue with it.
I mean, I don't have an issue with it.
Yeah, no, they do good landscaping there. Whatever they do is going to look good.
Okay. Can we, are we ready to, we have a, Jeff
is that a
seconded
motion?
it?
Yeah, I second it.
Yeah.
Good motion.
All those in favour? 4-0.
All right, on to number 2.
4-1, and one opposed. Okay. I do think we need to keep
Yeah, roll on.
moving. The number 2, erosion control. So is there any soil disturbance associated with this project or a possibility of erosion occurring as a result?
There is. They have sediment control barriers illustrated on the plan in adequate locations.
What did you,
There is soil disturbance, but there are sediment control barriers, sediment barriers located in the plans.
Was that a motion?
So do you feel that
There was
they've,
discussion.
yeah. So you would feel that they've addressed that? There is a possibility of erosion and soil disturbance, and that has been accounted for? Does anybody,
Motion?
does anybody
Yeah,
else
there
have
was some
any
discussion?
discussion on this one? No? Not
Motion
make a
ready?
motion?
Yeah, I move that the number 2, section 6, erosion control is satisfied with the location of sediment control barriers on the plan as depicted.
Second.
On Plan C2?
Yeah, that's just a detail sheet. Nobody looks at that.
Okay, all those in favour? Say ayes, 5-0, unanimous. Number 3, relationship of the proposed building to environment and neighbouring buildings.
I don't think it applies, does it?
So is there a building being constructed as part of this project, and if so, will the results be compatible with the surrounding buildings?
We
So that's-
we did not touch on the one storage
Oh, the
shed to be
structure
replaced.
storage shed, yeah.
That didn't come up today. It did in the pre-application meeting.
Yes,
But I don't think it's much of an issue here. I just think we should note that there is actually a building coming up here.
so there is a building being constructed as part of this
And being
project.
in a location where one currently exists.
Right, replacing another building, correct.
Okay,
So is there a building being constructed? Yes. So unless there's discussion, I would move that there is a building and that the applicant has represented that it will fit on the footprint of the existing building and match it'll be compatible with the surrounding buildings.
And environment, yep. Perfect.
Second.
okay, all those, if there's any discussion on this? No? All those in favour? Say aye.
Aye.
So that's 5-0. Okay, vehicular access, parking and circulation. So any changes to the existing road layout? Yes, do we, so,
Road, no, but
do we possibly need to address this in any more detail?
I think it includes like crosswalks in here, doesn't it?
Does-
Pedestrians.
yeah,
Oh,
could
we
see.
need to address it.
And exit and entryways, so,
The exit and entryways, have they changed?
well, yeah, this is a new entryway here.
Okay. So the proposed, let me read it then. The proposed site layout shall provide for safe access to and egress from public and private roads. A, any exit driveway shall be so designed as to provide the following minimum site distance measured in each direction as measured from the point at which the driveway meets the public or private right-of-way. The streets serving the site shall be adequate to carry the anticipated traffic, and the site plan shall locate points of access to avoid hazardous conflicts with existing turning movements and traffic flows. And C, pedestrian ways shall be safely separated from vehicular traffic. As the applicant,
It was stated that speed limit is 10 miles an hour there,
Yes.
which doesn't pertain to this table.
I don't think we're creating a new exit.
No, it's not a new entrance.
Correct.
It's a curb cut onto a road.
I would highlight that the applicant also submitted the reviews by the Camden Fire Chief, the Camden Police Chief, and the Director of Public Works, all of whom have said that they think that they don't anticipate a problem with the proposal, and they've reviewed it for safety. The one thing I think I would note is the fire chief did mention ensuring sight lines for cars backing in and out of parking, because an accident to the access road can create an impediment to accessing the facility. So I believe he's talking to these spots along Community Drive. Make sure they have sight lines coming out when they're backing out of those spots so that there's no accident there, because then you'd have a hard time getting an emergency vehicle through.
And he also mentioned about traffic calming to be able to address that, and that's where we had discussed potentially speed bumps, but then we're going down the road right now of these crosswalk signs at all 3 locations.
And he thinks that he's satisfied.
He's satisfied with that.
Satisfied with
All
that
3.
as well.
Is one of those crosswalks new?
Yes, the one closest to the Anderson Inn is the new crosswalk.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further comments about parking and access, gentlemen?
No, I'm good.
Somebody wants to make a motion?
I make a motion, the applicant has addressed item number 4, vehicular access, parking, and circulation adequately.
I second that.
All those in favour? Aye, 5-0. Okay, surface water drainage, number 5. Will there be changes made to the site that change the existing stormwater flow?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So adequate provision shall be made for surface drainage, so removal of storm waters will not have an unreasonably adverse effect on neighbouring properties, downstream water quality, soil erosion or the public storm drain system. Whenever possible, on-site absorption of runoff water shall be used to minimise discharges from the site. Drainage facilities shall be designed for a 25-year storm frequency. How's the applicant satisfied this criteria? Jeff?
Me?
Yeah, you're the expert on this.
Well, we haven't seen any stormwater caps, right?
Not caps, I've given you a narrative. Basically, what we have is an extensive collection and drainage system that currently surrounds the inn and connects up with additional drainage in Quarry Hill Drive, routes through the quarry, the historical quarry on the property that acts as a wet pond and controls that stormwater. So the new increase is 7,000 square feet of new impervious. It's de minimis on the project.
And we have the note on the site plan here saying, owner shall comply with its site location of development permit, which covers stormwater and runoff. With the existing quarry on site and its obvious capacity, I don't see any deleterious or detrimental effects downstream of this from the proposed activities. As such, I feel like number 5 is they fulfilled number 5.
Yeah, I remember that from the pre-application meeting as well that we discussed, so I'm comfortable with that.
St. Laurent, the Public Works Director, looked at this quite extensively, too, to make sure. I mean, we do have drainage issues in the Jacobs Avenue area, as everyone probably knows. And this does drain down out that way eventually. But Dave did look at it. He looked at actually old plans from the engineer, the design engineer, and he's confident there's no impact downstream.
Okay. Sounds like your motion, Jeff.
Confident to move forward? Yeah, you get to
Yeah.
make this one.
I make a motion that number 5, surface water drainage, has not been significantly impacted, and the applicant is going to comply with its site location of development permit.
Second?
All those in favour? Aye, 5-0. Number 6, public utilities. Will there be any additional facilities using sewer, water or other utilities, and will any additional water be discharged into the storm drain system?
No.
No,
No,
Not
so
applicable.
not
I don't think
applicable.
so. Not a-
And make a motion, not applicable.
Okay, we don't need to even make a motion, okay.
Make a motion to skip over it?
You don't just get to pick the
Interesting
easy
one.
ones.
I know you say it's not applicable, but if you read down, it says it is eventually getting into our storm drains and our storm system, right? Eventually.
From the quarry,
Right.
well, or is it? Or is it going down into the groundwater?
Well, I guess it's not getting into our storm drains, it's getting into this. I keep confusing, we're not an MS4 community, so we're not going to count ditches and streams as stormwater conveyances like I had to in Bangor. So, no, that's not a stormwater,
Go with not applicable.
not applicable.
Not in Bangor anymore.
No, thank goodness.
Okay. So did we vote on that one? We just voted on that
You
one?
don't need to vote.
But that's
Consider the
okay.
storage area, I think that it's not.
On to 7, Jeannie's on to 7, special
Oh, yeah,
features
I was
of
like, wondering what
development.
you were
No, that's
talking
good.
I was like, wait,
We
storage
don't need to
shed?
vote on 6 because we're saying it's not applicable, right? Everybody's
Confirmed.
okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. So number 7, special features development. Are there any new exposed storage areas, exposed machinery installations, service areas, etc., associated with this project?
yes,
Yes.
We're going to say yes because
yes.
of the shed. Is that what you'd consider the
And
new?
fences, and, there's things being added that might be referred to as special features.
Okay.
The storage building,
So I'm just going to read what we have to, the criteria has to be met.
Decide whether or not it is, it isn't,
Okay,
it applies, it doesn't.
Richard thinks it is. Do we want to address this, board?
Given that it's replacing an existing building, I'm not sure that there's too much
Yeah.
that applies here. But I understand that it could fit under there if we felt like, we haven't even talked about really screening of that other building. It's replacing an existing footprint in another building, so we're talking about this guy right here, so.
Well,
Back down an existing foundation.
So just,
when it's not saying storage shed, it's exposed storage areas.
And similar structures, utility buildings and similar structures.
Utility buildings is what got me on it.
That's where I'm going with.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah.
I mean, a parking lot could kind of become an exposed storage area.
can I just read this out for the record? So exposed storage areas, exposed machinery installations, service areas, truck loading areas, utility buildings and similar structures shall have setbacks and screening to provide a buffer to sight and sound sufficient to minimise their adverse impact on other land uses within the development area and on surrounding properties. So we're just,
I make a motion that there's negligible impact.
It is all buffered around that existing shed already, just so you all know.
okay.
Vegetation all around it.
And the existing setback would be 15 feet.
Correct.
and would this paragraph include things like the fence you're putting in front of those 8 new parking places? That's 3 feet tall, right?
That's proposed to be a 3-foot tall
Okay.
fence, yeah.
And it doesn't eclipse any of the windows in the,
Right, that's the
building.
objective, is it's not going to,
and it's what, there to, like avoid automobile.
Headlights, yeah.
Headlights, et cetera? Okay.
yeah, that's,
Well, should we vote on it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're ready, that would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ready?
Okay, did you have one teed up to go?
Yeah, I make a motion that special features of development, while there is a storage shed proposed, that really is not applicable.
I second that. All those in favour? Say aye. 5-0. Number 8, exterior lighting. Will there be any additional exterior lighting, and does lighting design comply with the zoning
This one's
ordinance?
your thing, I think you got
It
that.
is.
I think we've
Does-
heard from the applicant
yeah.
that they're using, they provided a bulb, but they've also explained during this hearing that, or review, that they are using full cutoff features, so as long as we condition the motion on
I'm
full
going to make the
cutoff.
motion, it's going to be
Yeah,
shorter than that.
this is a discussion.
Okay.
You can make the motion.
Okay.
But as long as it covers full cutoff and that they represented that they will be using full cutoff fixtures, I'm comfortable with it.
Okay. Good.
Good.
Mark?
Just for clarification, they're adding one light fixture?
Correct. And moving a couple others, but
Relocating.
adding one.
Right, so for clarification,
Yes.
they're just adding one light fixture, which is the same as all the rest,
Yeah.
and moving two?
Moving one.
Made the motion?
she has
You made
not.
the motion?
No, if we're good to go, I will. Okay, so I'll make a motion that the applicants have met the requirements for exterior lighting. There will be one new lighting fixture, which will be dark sky compatible and match the existing, and one fixture that will be moved.
Second.
All okay. All those in favour?
Aye.
5-0.
Didn't have to count.
Number 9, emergency vehicle access. Will the access for emergency vehicles to this area be changed?
I don't see how that applies, to be honest.
Okay.
They're not narrowing any of the drives.
Yeah, there was just the concern of the traffic backing into Community Drive, but that was satiated with the visibility.
I think that was more had to do with the vehicle maneuvers and pedestrians, so I think we
Not
covered that
access.
under 4.
So I think we can skip
I
on
would
that
suggest
one.
this doesn't apply.
Okay.
Do with that?
Okay, we don't have a pier or a wharf in this, so number 10 doesn't apply.
Nor does 11.
And neither does 11 because we're not in an applicable zoning district. Right. Is that it?
And 12 doesn't
That's
apply.
12.
That's it then.
I guess what was 12? Whatever it is, it doesn't apply.
Oz. Oz. Business zone. We rarely
Okay,
get into
all right. So we've voted on all of these and passed all of them.
So we have an overall.
So now you need a motion that
Approve the project and then do all conditions as a part of it.
they have to approve that and then
Right.
it can be heard as an amendment.
Okay, so I would make a motion that we can hear this application as an amendment to site plan.
Second that.
All those in favour? Aye, that's
Aye.
5-0.
Now do your approval.
Approval with the four conditions.
State conditions?
No, I think that was.
You can say as above.
Did you want this?
As discussed.
Oh, I think I've got one else. Okay, so I make a motion that we approve the application for this Quarry Hill site plan as an amendment with the conditions, no?
4 conditions.
Conditions.
With the 4 conditions as discussed tonight.
Second that.
All those in favour? Aye.
Aye.
5-0.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Bill.
Evening, sure appreciate it.
Yeah.
Drive safe on Corey Hill Road. You don't know when you'll run into this guy.
Watch
over
out for
there,
Richard.
huh? Cruising through.
I saw you taking my license
You're the
number.
last one in town.
will see me.
Trying to park in there, right?
He drives an Audi.
It's always the Audi drivers.
You got an Audi too, don't you, Bill?
Cruising out here too. That's right.
I used to think it was the Jetta drivers, but it's the Audi drivers.
Oh, yeah, the whole different class there, yeah. All right.
I think the Jetta drivers just grew up. That's what happened.
Graduated to Audis. I went from a Beetle to a Mini. What does that say
I
about
think
me?
you're going the right direction. I've been driving beat up old Saabs for
There you go.
Really going to keep those?
reduce, reuse,
They don't make them
recycle.
anymore.
Huh?
They don't make
I
them
just got to
anymore.
seed them out. I just got another one.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, from Florida.
No
No
rust.
rust all over the
Oh,
bottom. Beautiful,
yeah, I got you.
beautiful car.
are starting.
You're a true believer.
I am.
Discussion tonight, aren't we, this stuff?
Well, and I talked to Allison.
That's a joke. Right. My jokes don't get, apparently my jokes do
I
not.
got that one.
The lawyer jokes, that was a good
Can I
one.
sit next to
Good
this?
job.
Big ones, aren't they? These are duplicates. of the-
Teaching Ethan how to be funny, that's good.
God, this is gonna be a long night.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a long time. Can we get food here?
That's right. I think that, we're, is there no
Are you
rules?
ready to, I could just have too much fun with you guys. It's good that they don't let us have beer. We'd really be in trouble.
There's no law against eating in the meeting, is there?
Drinking beer in the meeting, no.
It's eating.
I-
I don't know, you're always trying
Might
to
be
go.
noisy. Are you hungry?
Why are you always trying to go? I'm starving.
We're having a presentation.
We
Oh,
are.
yes.
It's the same plans that you have, paper copies.
Okay.
And this is just a mini version of the larger, I'm not mistaken.
How are you getting on? Still getting set up here.
Okay. Grading, drainage, and control.
We can.
And maybe I can just start this off a little bit. This is a
What's
pre-application meeting for,
What's pre-app?
pre-app meeting only for the middle school's project. As you know, when you reviewed this prior, and I don't, Ethan wasn't here, nor was I, but I think the other board members were. There was a practice field proposed for the location where the MET building is. The MET building obviously had generated a fair amount of community concern about what was going to happen to the MET building. There was a vote to keep the MET building, and then there was a budget vote, just certain dollar amount to renovate the MET building. Both of those things passed. So what you have before you is just, there's a pre-app meeting showing where that, what was going to be a practice field is the MET building, and then some parking and some associated improvements around that building. You'll also note that there are some other changes. The best way to look at those changes on your plan are in the 11 by 17 sheet, I think it is, right? That is redlined. You'll also note that within that, or is that 8 by 14? 8 by 14? Whatever it is. There are some changes that I have approved along with Steve Wilson as minor field adjustments. Things got changed. There's some grading changes. There's a building that was located, some equipment for the thermal heat facility, sewer location changes up front, minor elevation changes. I mean, there's been a handful of minor modifications, field adjustments that we've approved. Those show up on this plan too, I believe. And then, so what you're really looking at is, for the most part, really the changes to the site where the MET building is staying and the parking that is needed for that. Good summary?
Well said.
Okay,
Well said.
we're done. Okay, go ahead. And Steve Sargent and Tyler Barter?
Barter.
Yep, from Oak Point.
It was well said. I mean, well summarized by Jeremy. If you just have a PowerPoint we brought here tonight to hopefully help you better understand what these changes consist of and talk more about our proposed changes around the MET specifically. And we can also talk about and show you some of the changes that were described by Jeremy as far as grading and some of the miscellaneous utility changes that have happened over time. Our tack at this point has been anything that would be under construction immediately. We tried to address because it's time sensitive. We have that administrative approval process, but other changes that may be associated with work that's not going to happen until next spring, summer. We've been trying to hold off and instead of peppering him with numerous changes to try to address those all at one time. And that's where we are at this point in the process, I think it's fair to say. And we've also got to a point with, besides the referendum, and we've been into, and the architect would probably better to discussed is Tyler, but in our process with the development of the design for the MET. So that's taken us some time to get our feet under us in that, get to a point where we felt comfortable sharing those details with the board. And we feel we're there now, and I'll show you what we're up to. So, the first drawing here, and all these drawings are in the package, is the preliminary site plan. We included the preliminary site plan, a utilities plan, and grading plan in your package, along with some renderings of the MET building. But I'm just going to jump forward just because I think that
Really quick, while you're there, Steve, maybe just with the, do you have a pointer there or no?
we do.
I was just going to, just for everyone I think knows where the MET building,
Yes.
but that's the area that we're really talking concern mostly about, I think, is that area and the parking that's around that.
It's the existing MET that's
Yeah.
now remaining.
Because that was going to be, again, a practice
Referendum
field.
vote. Yep.
Yeah.
Highlighted on the red line version, right?
It will
It
be.
is highlighted in there.
Just jump forward, I think it'll help.
Yep.
So this is essentially an overlay of the approved plan over the revised drawing, the preliminary revised drawing. Anything in red is underneath is the revised drawing, which is beneath the black line work of the approved drawing. So I think it just depicts the changes, and being the MET, whoops, hit the wrong button, sorry. There we go. That was it. A little complicated. So the MET building, and you can see beneath this was, there's an outline of the athletic field that was there previously. There was some track and field throwing stations and a high jump pit there. Essentially, it was an open turf field beforehand, and we had provisions for some walkways to come up and through there to allow the pedestrian traffic to pass through and along the bus barn to the after-school programs. And so this building remaining now, and the efforts to repurpose and reuse this building for the school, I think maybe better outlined by Tyler as far as its intent, because the architecture, sure, go ahead.
So the current plan that we're utilizing for the MET, the first floor is going to be utilized by the high school Zenith program, so that's our alternative education program. That's going to take up pretty much the entire floor. The second floor is going to serve as the central office for the school district, so that's going to be primarily office and meeting spaces. The basement level at this point is going to be largely undeveloped, and with the exception of some district storage and the possibility of some improvements to that space going forward. We're doing a pretty fair amount of improvements on the interior with new vertical circulation, egress components, and then moving the primary entrance for this to the south side of the building on kind of that narrow side adjacent to the parking lot. So the Knowlton Street entrance will be maintained, but it would be more of a kind of keeping the historic appearance of that building, but not a primary entrance point. From there, the majority of the work that we're doing is interior. So it's going to be the MET proper that remains. The remaining parts of the building are going to be demolished as part of the middle school construction project. So that'll take us down to the footprint that you see on this plan.
So from a site side, in really, a lot of the improvements are associated with trying to accommodate the new entrance and really make the existing parking area more usable and efficient in the big picture. Also, to control the access a little better off of Knowlton Street, and it's a relatively wide open paved area at this point in time. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And so the idea behind it is right now the parking area is really almost right up to the property line, so it's abutting a residential property, is to try to create some space there. There was additional pavement, meaning we had a drive aisle that now serves as a drop-off space. Then we had some landscaping, and then we actually had a parking tier with one drive aisle and parking on both sides, which is relatively inefficient. So we're able to redesign the parking area to control the access and remove the existing pavement over here and possible other movements out of this parking area. and control it to the one spot and create one drive aisle with parking, perpendicular parking in and out, and then turning into one-way parking an aisle 14 feet wide coming on the west side of the MET, and to incorporate this and with the middle school parking, being able to make a driveway connection into the middle school parking lot just for, I think it's improved circulation around the schools. There is an existing, this is actually an existing crosswalk that's here right now that we had previously shown to be removed, but because this is now remaining, I think it makes a lot of sense to leave this crosswalk here. And then this crosswalk was part of the approved plan, which this one would then be eliminated. And there was a lot of discussion about moving that up to this point, so it could be better utilized coming from the other direction too. So the pedestrian traffic sidewalk, I mean, on the east side of Knowlton Street would be expected to cross for the MET. There is an existing sidewalk here. We're not proposing any improvements as a part of, like, I'm going to qualify this as like as the base package, bid package that would ultimately put out in the street for this. There's been discussions about this with your public works folks and utility companies about trying to make this improvement out here, but we are conflicted with some utility pole locations and trying to address that. We would have a sidewalk coming across the front of the south side of the MET. And I will note this is the existing sidewalk location and the existing curb line right here. It's not really being changed in horizontal location, although there is some minor vertical changes in the grades there. So, and we've got a number of utility services that are crisscrossing the parking lot also. So from a construction point, and I think it's a prudent thing to really just, we would be anticipating removal of all this and just redeveloping that parking lot at essentially the same, very, very close to the same grades, and all within, for the vast majority of the existing pavement area. There'd be some landscaped areas immediately butting the building, about 7 feet wide across the west side. As far as the circulation would go, traffic vehicles could enter through the driveway here and could turn around. This would be a two-way. Once we get into this would be a one-way section of road that would have to travel via this driveway connection and then through the middle school parking lot. From a parking standpoint, we have 42 parking spaces within the MET to the west and to the south, and we would lose 7 parking spaces out of the approved middle school parking lot to accommodate that. Just some other things to note, I think, while we're here. I mean, there's some slight changes to the path that we're showing that are relatively minor. Just has more to do with the elevations and grades that would be remaining here. And before, this was at field level, this would be up more at the parking lot level now, and just trying to work a little better with the existing pavements that are there. There's really not much change in this parking tier, although this is getting shifted over about a foot to create some workable landscaped islands in here. And we'd make a connection. I guess the other thing to note, sorry, just to jump back to the pedestrian circulation, is that after school, the pedestrian circulation would come down a sidewalk along the west side of the parking area. And then we previously had this termination of a path there, picking up again here, and you'd walk across the field. From a number of efficiencies, we're looking at that as being an extension of the existing, extension of the redeveloped parking area. So we'd have like a 5-foot sidewalk at the same elevation, and I will note that as the parking paved area to allow that passage of pedestrian traffic. And also part of that reason is for drainage purposes, just to leave it down as opposed to creating a raised sidewalk, and also for maintenance and plowing purposes to allow snow to be plowed off into over into the turf area adjacent to the fields. Other things to note just in this plan really that are relatively minor, and just some of the other parts to this that I think we've mentioned. Really, a lot of the other changes are associated with just construction coordination, phasing, things like that. And there's some smaller items that we've done as some to help improve some of the design that we had done before. For instance, I mean, the transformer got slightly moved. That was in coordination with subsequent discussions with CMP. We ended up adding like a handhole. I mean, to me, like relatively minor things, and that was in subsequent coordination with Consolidated Communications. We added a couple small catch basins on the landscape islands up in here, and just redirected some of the drainage, which I can show you on the other plan.
And those were some of the adjustments that you approved, or those
Some.
part of the?
Yeah, I mean, really, and I think the adjustments that we've talked about up to this point in time have been related to utilities. I can talk about that, and that's some of the other things. Is right here, and this is one of the ones that we've started on, is that what we call it a utility shed, frankly, but it's for the sewer thermal system. This is the sewer thermal system was something that really was, I think, finalized more towards the time when we were putting the project out to bid, and I believe that we had met with the selectmen relative to this because it required some work off our property onto the wastewater treatment plant property in coordination with this. And essentially what the sewer thermal system entails, if you've heard anything about it or know anything about it, is that we're intending to extract some heat out of the effluent process of the wastewater treatment plant via heat exchanger that's going to be housed in this sewer thermal shed. And then at that point, that there'll be some utility lines that will carry, I guess, like a food grade glycol, I think is what we're using, right? Back to the building, and it'll be using the heat for the purposes of heating the building. The building would also have a backup system, but that's considered the primary heat source.
For a portion.
For a portion?
Yeah.
So, and this works from, I think there's a synergy here because and I'm not an expert in wastewater treatment plant, but the biological processes, associated with a wastewater treatment plant generally raises, creates a warming of the waters, and this in turn would take some of that temperature back out of that water. And it's light at that. I'm talking a couple degrees Fahrenheit is I think what we're looking at was about the extent of it. And this is all being extracted and returned to is a manhole right here that's just upstream of their disinfection system. And it's a relatively minor amount of work that we would be using. We'd be installing like a pump essentially, which is like a vertical turbine pump on top of that manhole to provide the circulation of that water out into the heat exchanger that's housed in the building, and it would just return via another pipe. It's relatively simple. So that was one, and there's just some underground utility lines that extend from there around the side of the building and back in over here, which are depicted on the utilities drawing at this point in time.
What kind of electricity demands do the heat pump, is the heat pump going to?
I don't know if I can answer that one.
I don't know the demands exactly, but it's essentially a geothermal system, and instead of using, in-ground
The
wells.
electricity bill goes up every time somebody puts one of those in, and I was just wondering what it's going to cost.
I'm sure we have, I'm
Yeah,
sure we
I
have
can-
some numbers
I'm sure
on
we
it.
can get that if it's
Yeah.
something you're.
It's not a part of it. I was just curious, really.
Yeah, we'll have higher electric bills, lower gas bills.
Yeah. Yeah, otherwise, there's LP gas tanks, I think, that we were showing over on this side, over in here, on the original approved drawings. I think the number we had originally shown were 2. Those would service the condensing boilers, which would be considered, I guess, somewhat of a backup and heats the other portion of the building at this point in time. So we've added 1 over there. That's the type of utility changes that you're going to see on the utilities plan, for the most part. Outside of that, there's some utility improvements to the MET. We'd have a new water service, which is going to come off to the north side of the MET. We have a new electric service, which and this is part of our coordination I was referring to with CMP and Consolidated Communications, is coordinating that over from a utility pole drop on the sort of northeast corner of the MET. Would have a new sanitary connection, which is going to come out the west side of the building, and it's going to connect into the sanitary system, collection system that services the middle school and eventually connects into the manhole in Knowlton Street. And as far as, I think maybe we'll just leave it at that for now. I don't know if there's any questions on the site plan before I move on to like grading.
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
It appears that pedestrian egress from the building is now surrounded on 3 sides by vehicles. And I wonder if you could talk to me about, like, the Zenith students wanting to get out of the building and going into the athletic fields. Are they going to be, is it necessary to come down to that one crosswalk? Or will they be cutting through where parked cars are?
I don't think the intention is that Zenith utilizes those fields.
Oh, don't they? Okay. But even for a casual person to walk by there, it's like it's surrounded by cars now. Had you?
Well, this will be the primary entrance now. That's to the south
Right.
side. That's what's, and we can show you some renderings so you can see that if you
Yeah.
maybe
I
visualize.
saw
it a
where you
little bit.
renamed the building. On this rendering, it's called Mount Batty
Oh,
Building.
yeah, I noticed that. Where did that come from?
Mount Batty. What do you think? It's a nice name. But that's my concern, is that it looks like coming from 3 of the 4 sides now, you're immediately engaging
Yeah, I
pavement
mean,
and
I
automobiles.
think from a circulation standpoint, pedestrian, I mean, what this allows is that there's also a crosswalk right here.
Yeah.
And then there's right along the side of the parking in between the fields and the parking area, this is going to be a pedestrian walkway.
Has it,
It's going to be a striped pedestrian walkway, right there.
How many parking spaces in total are with the Mary Taylor School and the middle school now?
The whole number is, I think it's 179, that's 173, off the top of my head.
I think that includes some space at the bus barn as well.
It does. 173 is the total on site.
That's what was required?
So the requirement is much lower than that.
Yeah, that was sort of one of the questions that I had. I was looking at the parking information just on the plan here. I'm looking at the site plan overlay, and it says parking spaces provided 138 and parking spaces required 79. So, and again, I wasn't involved in the original review, so I may have some questions that seem obvious to other people, but obviously, it wasn't your necessarily in your control to keep the Mary Taylor building, but we lose all those practice fields, and then there's all this new parking. And so my question first was, is that new parking specifically because we're retaining the Mary Taylor building that we need to have that? Or is that just added as an extra benefit for?
I think there's I think there's a fair amount of new parking associated with the programs moving from the bus barn. That bus barn is going to be repurposed into other components and functions, some bus barn, some future storage, some other things that are going to require parking as well. So, I mean, there's a fair amount of additional parking requirements with maintaining square footage on the site.
So that's because of administrative functions that right now go on in the bus barn, which no longer will go on there, but some of those administrative functions are moving into the Mary Taylor building.
All of them are moving from the bus barn, with the exception of transportation is staying in the bus barn.
Right, so I guess my question then, to sort of try to narrow it down, is the Mary Taylor building was originally not on the plan, now it is. Are there required parking spaces for that building specifically?
Yes.
And those are the ones that we're doing here now, or are they?
Yes, I mean, the parking requirements, the way that yours read, because this is a middle school, and I'm sorry, what I can actually read in my plan here is limited, is in zoning for 15 years and younger, which under the parking calculations is one space for each room of instruction. So for middle school itself, when you do that calculation, I mean, you're talking one space, I mean, there's 37 classrooms. The calculation requires actually 37 parking spaces. But a part of the design process, I mean, what we do is we evaluate the need and the functions of the school and come up with a number of parking spaces required. And really, I think what we've shown up to this point, being this parking area over here and some limited staff parking spaces over here, are going to be largely used. And at this point in time, I think one of the things that, I'm just going to jump back to when we were originally talking about this, there's a fair amount of usage of parking right now
On the street.
on the street. Now, that, for all intents and purposes, is expected to now go away, that usage, and be primarily within the parking lot.
Yeah, I would say that our standard, lots of standard for school parking requirements for schools are way too low for the actual need and demand out
Yeah,
there.
I'm just trying to get a handle on,
yeah.
on whether this parking is necessary, and then from that, the practice field that was there and what it looks like the track and field stuff, I know, again, this is not your choice necessarily, but have those been relocated, or is there a plan for those, or are they just gone?
They have not been relocated at this point in time, and one of the other changes that you will note on the drawing is that there was also a long jump pit that was incorporated over here, which has been removed
Okay.
as a part. That's, I think, part of more of like what we termed as a value management process.
And I think it's also important to note that that practice field didn't exist in the program prior to us. So
Right.
it's not a current, it was a kind of a nicety that was able to be
Yeah.
utilized by.
Right, but
not
it
having-
is something that was on the original plan that is no longer going to be offered, and you haven't really made,
There is no additional space on the site
Do it,
for
to do
a
those
practice
things.
field in that item.
unless, that was where my question was kind of headed, was unless all that parking was unnecessary. But you probably still couldn't shoehorn it in there either.
Oh, I think even, yeah, that's,
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some places where you could, here or there, add some facilities in here. I mean, these are relatively minor facilities. I mean, this is a throwing circle, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, but at this point in time, I think there's a number of things, and I don't want to speak on behalf of that, that's preventing us from doing that.
Right, yeah, so I'm just, again, it's, for me, it's just a question of, is the parking necessary, is there a better use of the
I
space?
I think from a use standpoint, for the building itself, I mean, and I don't have the breakdown actual right here, but I do have it broken down. I'm sorry, we do for the MET. The MET, we're showing a number of spaces for school and office and square footage associated with that right in the drawing, which is saying 54 spaces.
Okay.
So that's your parking, that's your actual, these are the revised, these are the numbers that are based on your parking, your codes.
For being familiar with that area and the parking needs there, parking is needed.
Yeah.
There's-
So when you have
yeah.
events, there's always a need,
And-
I'm not going to get it until next year, so I'm not familiar with the.
You will be.
Accidentally went down the road today.
So, on this parking here, you drive into the school parking lot and circle around there, and that parking lot is full. Now you have to drive out,
Yep.
and you could drive in the other parking lot
Yep.
for overflow parking. Now, if those angled spots were angled in the opposite direction, then you go in that parking lot, it's full, you go out and you angle park in the other direction and can continue out that way. Would that make any more sense?
I think one of the challenges that we try to utilize the fact that Knowlton Street's a one-way street, so we want to kind of loop them back around and not force them back out on the surface streets and out and around to the opposite end of Knowlton.
Because then if you come back out, you can come back into here
Do it
and
again.
then circulate.
see, yeah.
Otherwise,
Back in there again.
you've got to
Otherwise, yeah, you're
go back around.
taking a left.
Well, we're looking at those angled spots, and you have a flush curb there. Is there any thoughts on stall blocks to keep cars from rolling into the field?
Or into the sidewalk.
The reason why we haven't gone there at this point in time, I mean, yes, it is, that's one of the concerns, absolutely, but maintenance has a lot to do with it.
'Cause usually when I see a parking spot, so the parking spots adjacent to the bus barn between
Yep.
the field have a fence. And there's usually a fence between parking and athletic fields.
And this was more from a maintenance standpoint, is that from ease of maintenance and plowing and things like that, and having a place to push the snow.
So there's no safety concerns with
Well,
parking just
I mean,
right there.
frankly, I'm not trying to, I mean, certainly there's some concerns with that, you know what I mean? But most times it's how far do they park into the space? I mean, it's got to be striped. If I think there was an ongoing issue with it, then that may warrant something else being installed if there was a problem. I mean, this is for students to walk, from after school, to an after-school program primarily. And so that, it's a means of circulation, and, you're talking about walking by the end of a parked car. at that point in time. You know, versus if you had issues and, you know, think about Warren putting in like a stop block or something like that, then, you know, you could put blocks in. Again, we want to leave it open for drainage purposes, so it'll flow off. We don't want to catch anything and start directing any more water or anywhere else. It's just that it's maintenance, you know, and then you got a catch basin, you got a, you know, or something along those lines. We've got
No, I
pipes
hear you.
and costs and all that
I'm just
stuff that goes
wondering
with
if
it.
it was a safety issue.
I think, you know, from a not as significant as what goes on along Knowlton Street right now, let's put it that way. You know what I mean? I think this is much less. I mean, that's this whole sidewalk down in front of the, right now, I mean, the whole school. I mean, that's just flush with grade, and you got a couple of utility poles out there periodically that will, and it's, you know, we've improved a lot of that, just to go back to the other project. I mean, this all is going to be, you know, have a raised, you know, vertical curb on it. And this is something that we've been talking about trying to, you know, afford as a part of the project. But I think that's from a cost standpoint and doing that, I mean,
You're not expecting too much pedestrian activity behind those diagonal parking spaces? Hopefully you're not, because
well, I think, I mean, what's
this
a
drawing right
fair
here.
amount of, yeah, I mean, really just,
Yeah,
this
but-
might help a little bit.
tell me people aren't going to go that way, you know, like,
So here's our rendering of the,
Right.
and I don't know if Tyler can also talk about the building at this point in time. Yeah, so this is just the depiction of,
see, I was just anticipating that some people might exit the school, and in order to get over to where the, you know, playground is and other things, that they'd take the path of least resistance and walk down that asphalt road. And that was my only concern, that it's hard not, around here, I've noticed, like in front of the few places in town that have diagonal parking behind the post office, that it's difficult
Yeah.
to avoid not hitting another car, much less I would be concerned about a person walking there. You're-
What kind of people are you talking about when you say person? Like, you mean a community member or a student?
Well, I keep thinking of a Xena student.
Xena students won't be going to the middle school playground after school. I'm like, Xena students, it's not their campus, like, so they're not going to be walking around. They might be going to a car that's parked somewhere if they drove, but generally, Xena students aren't interacting with the middle school campus at all.
They don't, okay.
No.
Are they older, or is that?
Yes,
Okay,
they're high school students.
all right. Okay, I still have the concern, like,
Yeah.
you're a superintendent, you might walk out there and in a hurry to get to the school. I just was wondering about people walking on that asphalt drive with people backing out.
I mean, I think it's a lot safer than the situation not only on Knowlton Street, but right now we have, you know, the flow of student traffic to the teen center crosses in front of the bus barn, then crosses Lions Lane, where, you know, there's a pounded crosswalk into the pavement. Then there's a little thing up, but there are kids running back and forth across that street all afternoon
Okay.
with
Not
cars,
today.
construction vehicles. You know, here, there's no traffic other than the cars that are going to be parked there that, you know, it's kind of maybe it's a 2-hour window between 3 and maybe 5 where kids are going back and forth, but most of it's between 15 minutes when school gets out, they go to the teen center. It's a very short window where there are a lot of kids walking in that area. I mean, I don't see that as an issue at
Okay,
all.
I'm sure you reviewed it.
Yeah.
I just brought it up.
Any more questions?
I have a question. Just from a stormwater permitting question, do you need to update your permit with DEP on this?
yes, we do.
Okay.
We have discussed that with DEP, and I actually had some correspondence with them. This was quite a while ago when we started initially, like we
Yeah.
came back in, this was like in last April. And we're, their take on it was that we gave them essentially this plan. I mean, maybe not this exact version, but
Right.
plan that showed, this is the grading plan with the overlay on it. We can talk about some of those changes too that have happened. But essentially, we gave them this.
Yep.
And said, and this is, looking for how they wanted us to address these changes. And their feedback was, I believe it was a minor amendment, but they were looking at it more from a as-built timing of things, as long as we weren't changing anything of that would ultimately the permit conditions. Like going beyond our limits of, which would kick us into like a site location or something like that, as we're only a stormwater law at this point in time.
Right.
Because in their minds, essentially, I believe, and I don't want to speak for them, but I mean, by a lot of this project, we're really eliminating, we're basic standards. I don't know if it's just a reminder of 2 years ago. I'm sure nobody remembers that. We weren't into our general standards, which means we weren't required to treat stormwater necessarily because of the redevelopment calculations that we did. So this whole site being redeveloped, you can go through a series of calculations from the DEP's stormwater manual, and you come up with a number, and if that number is less than 0, then you're improving it, and you don't have to go through some of the treatment aspects of which this project is and still will be.
Okay.
So we're, from a stormwater law standpoint, and we're really a lot of this, the whole development around the MET, the basic standards is erosion control, essentially. We're eliminating the disturbance of this whole entire area for the most part when you look at it, because what we're really disturbing for parking lots, this is really more of a pavement replacement within the parking lot. It's like a maintenance. Certainly the pavements of the south side of the school are in decent shape, as they were just, I think, overlaid a couple of years ago. But the pavements along the west side are really in marginal condition, and I don't think would be sufficient to support the new circulation and traffic at this point in time, so they definitely need some improvement. And, given the various utilities, trenches and things like that that are cutting through this, would be left with a grid of, pavement patches and trenches, and at that point in time, it's just, not that much more, probably just to remove the existing pavement and replace it at one time. And you get one decent structure for the long term. So from that end, I think we're on the up and up, and we've actually been talking about that internally, about our timing now that we're at this point, if we want to do that. And really, it warrants another discussion with them now that we're here, and see what they want to do. But I'm not, we've talked to them about these things, and for instance, one of the things we talked about the changes, and I'll just note that while we're here too, is that there's some of the, we call this like maybe quote unquote like a value management process we went through for the purposes of trying to save money, and one of those things was to raise the baseball field by about a foot. That's a lot of the grading changes around here are associated with that. So you can look at, if you looked at some of these contour lines for the proposed grades, like the red being the new ones and the black are the old ones. These are being raised, and this outfield is flattened out over the soccer field a little bit too. But it would be hard to notice for somebody really to walk out there and see that in one condition or the other. And those grading changes spilled over into this field just because of how they would work
Match
with
up
each
with
other.
the other, yeah.
And there's, I guess it's fair to say, at this point in time, is part of that. I don't want to get into that, but this, the field hockey field and the softball field is uncertain that will happen. And you are fundraising still? Is that to try to make that happen?
We are. We're optimistic that we're going to be able to do that.
But that may be under separate contract.
Yeah.
And we haven't necessarily. And then really, outside of that, I mean, from this plan, I mean, there's been some various like tweaks to the grading that are relatively, I mean, from my perspective, I guess they're relatively minor when you look at, like grades around in here, just the way we wrap things around. There's still the same elevations within, fractions of a foot, generally speaking. Relatively minor. Some of the drainage will change, and this is, I guess, is from a drainage standpoint, really close to what we're doing. But the drainage will change, and we will update our drainage study to reflect that. And The reason why is that, we had balanced the site. We had a certain number of discharge locations of water that runs off, and one of them is into the municipal system within Knowlton Street. Another one enters a drainage system, closed drainage system in front of the bus barn. Other drainage was outletting a lot part of the existing field. There was like a surface drainage down a slope over here that we repaired and headed out that way. And then we had some a drainage pipe discharge coming out here at the north. And the tact in all those has always been to try to reduce the flow out in every direction, because we had a fairly decent reduction in the amount of impervious associated with the project in the past. Bringing the MET back, the impervious really comes to a point where it almost matches the existing. So it was just because of that and the way that the grades work over around the MET, from an impervious standpoint, it was pushing more out towards Knowlton Street. So we try to compensate for that and take it out in other directions in the revised drainage. So it's very close to the pre-development grades and the pre-development intensities and flow, volumes and intensities of runoff. One thing I will note, and we worked on the drainage study a fair amount. It's a relatively, trying to balance all these things is sometimes not an easy thing to do. But one thing we haven't really, one of our objectives with grading and drainage and everything like that has always been to improve the drainage of the fields. The fields have always had problems as far as drainage and usability. And so from what's existing, there have been some grades that have been steepened up a little bit, and the flow paths have been shortened a little bit, which is usually counterproductive to maintaining and matching, the flows and the intensity of runoff and the overall volumes but we also had a number of under drains that we have in here that they're going in to try to help that at the same time. One thing that we've really encountered and that we really haven't taken credit for, which is fairly substantial in that improvement, is the topsoil layers. Now, this topsoil, what was known and really became more and more apparent during our initial parts of construction, has a fairly sizable amount of clay in it, like almost 20%. So way more clay than we would ever want to have in a topsoil, especially in an athletic field. So as a part of the project, the topsoil, which has been stripped off and has been amended, and that amount, a portion of clay has really been reduced to something less than 10%. So much more sandy material and able to drain better.
So that's why you have more material to work with.
Yeah, you get a lot of material.
With all this, is the project still on schedule?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, I'm not sure if people have driven by there recently, but.
It's hard to see it from the road.
Yeah, it is, but they're wrapping up kind of the last rounds of siding. The classroom wings, we've seen floors and doors.
On the west side?
Yeah, the west side, the three-story classroom wing, from ground level up, ground level looks like classrooms. The rooms are waiting for ceilings, and they're kind of working their way up and then kind of focusing on the front of the building going forward. So it's looking pretty good over there. We're excited to see it.
How long will it take to demolish the old high middle
They start, I think, on June 12th, and they're going to start at the MET and work kind of south to north, and it's going to be a push. Next summer is going to be a busy time on that site.
So this is a pre-application meeting, right? So,
Yes.
right, so really it's an opportunity for the board just to raise any issues.
So we'll talk about one more thing. I think we've talked about quite a bit here. I think I may just want to note, this is the southern entrance, so there's a canopy that's being installed over that from the exterior structure. And then the last thing we just want to talk about quickly, this wasn't in the package, but we included anyway. We just, and this is very limited in information at this point in time, but just generally speaking, this is the landscape plan that our landscape architect is working on, which is adding the MET in and amending we're working with the buffers and the required buffers along the residential property over here. Largely, I think there's, most everything is really this remains the same as the approved drawing, although we may have some species of trees. I'm just not sure personally whether those are the same species that we originally approved or not. We will know that when we come back. And then the other thing she noted to me was just that we had some plantings over here we had included before from a buffer standpoint that we had removed, that she had to have a meeting with this abutter back, and I think it was like last January, and discussed, what any issues, concerns as far as landscaping and buffering. And their concern, I believe, was not really this, which I think there's already some substantial vegetation back here. So, and from what I'm understanding, wasn't necessarily required to meet, zoning requirements. And this was more of this area in here was more concerning just from a lighting standpoint, like when cars come in and turn left like they do now, although now instead of being feet away from the property line right here, now we've got, I think it's like 30 feet of green space, and that there's a series of arborvitaes and other shrub plantings in here, and a series of trees that are going in, and largely concentrating that buffer down here and not up in here. So, I mean, we do kind of look at this as somewhat of a, and I guess as a question from the board, as, it's kind of an existing pavement structure. So I think we've a point to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a discussion that the board doesn't get into. That's more of a code officer and myself make those determinations on what is grandfathered, what's not grandfathered, or what's allowed to stay. The board really ought not get into that. Otherwise, they start micromanaging the zoning ordinance.
Do that.
I'm just telling you.
So I guess that's really, at this point, I mean, I hope that gives you a pretty comprehensive view as to where we are in the process and what we have for, changes to the approved plans, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are and any concerns.
That's pretty comprehensive. I think that's good.
Looks good to me.
What sort of site lighting do you have in those parking lots? Similar to the
It would be the same fixtures, and there's, I believe it's, they are shown in here, we've got 1, 2, 3 fixtures there.
Oh, I see.
4, 5, 6, so there's 6 new fixtures that are going in.
We'll be updating the site calculations for the lighting as well through the process.
Great. Anything else from the board?
No,
Okay.
I like it. Good job, guys.
Do we take
Comments from the public?
From the public?
Sure.
At this point, please, would you mind just coming forward and grabbing a microphone from Jeremy and letting us know your name for the record, please?
Pat Scaling, I'm a Camden resident. I just wanted to ask if you might be sensitive to the entrance on the west side, since it is a historic building. The canopy, to me, looked pretty modern and bare-looking, and, just throwing that out there, that's all. It is a historic building.
Yeah, it is, and we intend to maintain that as an entrance, but from a circulation and building function, the west side works.
Yeah, no, that's
Better,
fine.
but,
No, I'm not, I think the west side is fine, but
I think it's the structure that you have,
structure,
the canopy over it.
We're talking about this here, right, Pat?
Yes.
Sorry,
I
I thought
just
you.
wanted to bring that to your attention.
That's a
What
good point.
connection does it have to the historic
Well,
structure surrounding it, right?
we're going to get into a historic conversation here after we do this on historic preservation stuff. Yes.
Tonight, are we?
Yes. It's on your agenda. But I just want to, having been involved in historic preservation for a long time, what you don't want to do on an addition or, a appurtenance that gets attached to a building that is historic, you don't want to try to recreate history. And the Park Service and the state SHPO will say the same thing. So you clearly need to differentiate between the two, right? And I'm just throwing that out there. So you may want to just reach out to the SHPO or something, and just say, hey, we're doing a small little entry, covered entry to a registered building. How would you treat it? Ask them how they would treat it, and you may.
Been registered, or?
It is. It's on the National Register. Or it's been nominated for. It's been nominated for. Correct. It's been nominated for, but it's certainly eligible for it. So that just might be. It might go a long way.
That was going to be
to-
one of my questions, actually.
But they may come back and say this is actually appropriate.
They
I'm
may.
just throwing that out there.
But I think
Conversation.
gesture by
Agreed.
maybe addressing
Yep.
something.
And that's easy enough. Doesn't change the project. Just may change how it looks. Okay?
Want to do that?
Anything else? Good?
Any public input on
Thank you. When are you looking to be here?
Discussion about amendments, so now we're filing our application for public hearing.
When are you thinking? It's an interesting question. I got to think about, you're not adding square footage, you're adding square footage to a site plan that had square footage going away. Do you know what I mean? So let me think about process on whether or not it's a hearing or not, because it may not be a full site plan application, it may just be an amendment to an existing plan.
Like we just
So,
did.
yeah, let me think about that, and I'll run it by the town attorney. But
First time the use of new use, right?
Correct.
But we're not adding square footage to the site. But I understand. When are you thinking of timing?
I mean,
I mean, the board is meeting, we're not meeting the regular first and third Thursdays in January.
before we can come back, I mean, we'd have to have everything in 2 weeks in advance of that next.
Correct.
meeting Anyway, whatever meeting, so.
15 days, so you're probably not
15 days, probably with the holidays. You say the 9th was next one?
in the 23rd.
I think the 23rd is the earliest of the.
Earliest you'd be here.
There's no way we can do the 9th.
Right, I understood. Yeah, okay. Earliest would be the 23rd for this. If not, we're off into February 6th.
Thank you.
Good to see you both.
Thanks, Maria.
So why am
All right, the fun stuff now.
Oh, the fun begins.
That's right. Your dinner's gonna be cold tonight.
Ooh, it's
We're gonna be here another hour.
30-minute wait time. I'm worried
He's
that
got
I
it
might be
down.
Tuesday.
He's
Might be
got it
waiting
down
tonight.
pat.
We're gonna be eating in a
You can
minute.
always tell when he goes to a bathroom break.
You know,
I'm just gonna start calling my order out.
All right,
as you Get up.
we've got still an agenda item on the, so we got to,
Okay. Yep, so which
Other.
needs to be
Right.
taken care
So,
of tonight. Okay.
as you recall, I'm working on some zoning amendments or some amendments to town ordinances. One that we had talked about in the past, about a year ago, was demolition review. It was originally called demolition delay. I think demolition review is a much better phrase. I did go to the select board and talk to them about priorities. I talked to you guys about priorities. You guys thought demolition delay should be a priority or demolition review. Select board agreed. They want me to work on demolition review. I have since met with some members of the Historic Resources Committee. The comp plan clearly talks about a historic preservation ordinance in town. It recommends it. People voted on that comp plan. Select board did. You guys did. Planning board did. And I understand that not everything in the comp plan gets implemented right off the bat, too. But so we're looking at demolition delay. I have spoken with some of the Historic Resources Committee folks. They're a little concerned about what demolition review ordinance does if there's really not a lot of teeth in it and there's no review. So I'm kind of in a little quandary on the select board said move forward on drafting some demolition review ordinance. I'm going to go to the select board in the first meeting in January and say, when we talk about demolition delay, there's two ways to get there. One is the demolition review ordinance, and that's all it is. Another one is a historic preservation ordinance, which has evaluation criteria for people changing historic properties. Would need a historic preservation commission to do that. I have had an initial conversation with at least one select board member about that, and they think we ought to look at historic preservation ordinance. I know it was looked at in the past, but the comp plan from 2017 says move forward on doing it. So I'm going to take both of those options to the select board in January, right off the bat. We're under a time crunch a little bit to get into the June ballot if we're going to go full historic preservation ordinance. That doesn't mean it's not possible. It also doesn't mean that, big things in town, that the select board wanted me to work on, like additional adult use marijuana ordinances. They wanted me to push those out to the presidential election in 2020 when it's going to be a big turnout. So we may end up doing that with historic preservation if we go down the road of historic preservation ordinance. I'm just throwing that out there. So I don't know if folks have any thoughts on it. I have been involved in historic preservation in the state of Maine for a long time, about 18 years. So I have been intimately involved with historic preservation ordinances, historic preservation commissions, design review, what that means. A lot of people talk about color police, and you can't tell me what colors to paint, we don't have to go down the road of colors, to be honest with you. Just throwing that out there. I want to know your thoughts on it. And then I know that there's folks from the Historic Resources Committee that are here that would probably voice their opinions and their thoughts on this as well. Any thoughts from you all? I mean, I'm going to get a little more direction from the select board, I think, on the first meeting in January on which way they want me to go. My initial thought was a demolition delay review ordinance or demolition review ordinance is a good bite at the apple, but and you can gauge the public's interest in it. If it overwhelmingly, is supported, then we could maybe look at doing a full historic preservation ordinance in November. That's a thought. That's maybe a way to go about it. But I'm going to chat with the select board again in probably the first meeting in January. Would love to know your thoughts so I can share that with them. And then I think the Historic Resources Committee members would probably like to chime in on this as well. That makes sense?
From my perspective, I'd actually like to hear from the folks first and then
Okay.
share our thoughts.
Sounds good.
Because we'd be informed by some of their opinions.
Sure.
Me too, yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to come for a comment. Pat, Michael, anyone?
Well, I was really more interested in where you guys were, but,
Okay.
that's.
Come on up.
I'll come up.
I know.
Really, the Historic Resources Committee.
Pat, you need to
Yeah, push the button when you're there.
Yeah.
And just for the record, your name again, sorry.
There. The Historic Resources Committee really hasn't talked about this or addressed this for a long time
Right.
because I talked with you in May and just kind of gave you an overview of some ideas of what other people are doing and why it's important. But we really have just waited to see if there was any interest with this group. And so I didn't prepare anything tonight because I thought it would be more interesting to see what your thoughts were. And then I can just tell you off the top of my head what a couple of ideas that I had, but I'm more interested in I understand you've been to a workshop, some kind of workshop. This is Michael Scaling, by the way, my husband. He has been volunteering on the committee. Judy McGurk is here, she's on the committee, and Dennis has been volunteering on the committee too. But honestly, we haven't talked about this since May.
And I'll probably come to your meeting in January.
Jeremy, last Monday.
Yeah.
He said he wanted to have a workshop, and I said, okay, well, let's have a workshop, see where people are.
So you'd be working with all buildings, not just public buildings?
And Pat, maybe I'm just going to clarify, and I think because Richard came in and he had some comments on something, and I said, our Historic Resources Committee only reviews projects right now that are town-owned buildings.
Yeah, but it needs to be broader.
Well,
Because where those little bites are being taken out of the community on residential projects that are having a big impact. And the public buildings don't even number that many in town.
Well, on the committee, we've talked about looking at the historic districts, Chestnut and Chestnut and High Street coming in, but then also maybe including the other corridors coming in like Elm Street, Mechanic, some of those more historic areas.
Am I hearing that on those historic districts, Chestnut, High Street, you do have a purview now over residential buildings?
No, we don't. I mean, just because they're on the historic register, there are absolutely no protection for those buildings. They're named only, and that's what we'd like. We'd like to have a little protection for our corridors that really make the essence of this town. We just
But I
don't
think,
want
I
to.
mean, you asked where we were on this, and if, I don't want to speak for the entire board, but I think when we did discuss it, after we met with you, we felt like the demolition delay, we were something we would support, although we were sort of wary that it didn't have any teeth. And I think that's obviously your concern too. And there has to be a balance, of course, telling people what they can and cannot do and things like that. But I think generally, I don't want to speak for the board, but I for one, would support expanding your purview and also giving some teeth to some of the historic preservation. That's my personal position. But I do get to the point where Jeremy is regulating colors and things like that might be going too far down the road.
Yeah, and
So
we
there's
wouldn't do
balance
that.
and all of these things, but these buildings, I think, are critical to the
Character of town.
character of Camden. So,
Once they're gone, they're gone.
this is water under the bridge, but the red sheds that are gone from the harbor actually were things that I personally would have supported protecting, and didn't have anything that I could hang a hat on as far as saying you can't take that down.
The only, and just to clarify for the public, whoever's listening, the only protection there are for federal properties or listed properties on the National Register are if there's a federal undertaking, as if the feds come in and okay, here's one that you probably don't know yet, and they're going to come to you. The post office is looking to do some changes to the post office. They need to do an elevator. They need to do a stairway, actually. That is being reviewed since it is a federal undertaking. The feds have a process that they have to go through the Park Service and through the State Historic Preservation Office. They have to get it reviewed by them. It has to be okayed. If they find an adverse impact, then certain things need to be done to make it work. And they're going to come actually to meet with the Historic Resources Committee just as a courtesy, even though they don't have any review authority over it. So that's the only time that if any property on the National Register is protected. I mean, that's the only way unless there's a local preservation ordinance that does that.
And are there other communities around us that have better ordinances that you would recommend?
Yeah. There's, I think, 27
27, I think.
towns in the cities and towns in the
Are we
state.
talking Wiscasset as one of them or something like that, or?
Bath, York.
Wiscasset they proposed something, and Judy and I went and listened at that meeting, and since then, they've been through 17 revisions, and they still haven't approved it yet.
York, Castine.
Oh, that was
Castine would be one,
Damascotta,
yeah.
actually.
Or
That was
York,
Damascotta, not Wiscasset.
Gardner's one.
Yeah.
Augusta just, I think, became one. There's a big list, and I would look at all of those ordinances to find the one that I think that tries to balance everyone's interests and desires. If we become a certified local government, I will say this is another, so you can have a historic preservation ordinance. You can also have a historic preservation ordinance that meets the Fed standards, which is called the certified local government. If you are that, and when I say to these 20-some, these are 27 towns or cities and towns in the state that have a certified local government ordinance, that's what it's called, that enables that municipality to get pretty significant funds on a regular basis, because the National Park Service sends a certain allocation to each state's SHPO, and that's the State Historic Preservation Office. A certain percentage of that funding is required to go to certified local governments for historic resource inventories, historic studies, evaluations of projects, education campaigns, those kinds of archaeological work. All that stuff can be funded by Park Service dollars that comes through the state that we couldn't get unless we were certified local government, that these 27 other towns are taking advantage of
That money would go
every
to the
year.
Parks and Recs Department?
No,
to
that
be
would
used
likely
for-
go probably to the Planning and Development Department to work with the Historic Resources Committee, or at that point, a Historic Resources Commission to do further evaluations. Like if we're talking about expanding a district, there's a process to go through it to do that, and it's costly. You got to get people, so that funding could go to looking at other district potential. Jacobs Avenue is one, that's being looked at right now. If we were a CLG, we could actually spend federal
What's involved
dollars.
in that process?
The CLG process? An ordinance that, that the state, that SHPO would sign off on.
And is that a select board, is that a select board issue, or is that a planning
Well,
board
that would go
issue?
to the town voters, that would
Right,
go.
but I mean, but does it start with the planning board or the select board or whom? Or just you?
Well, it's going to probably, that's a good question. It likely may just be, if we do a standalone ordinance, the planning board may not be involved in it.
Right.
It may be just a standalone ordinance that the select board says, Jeremy, go work on, get the committee and planning board even just to be involved to kind of, work on it. But then that would just go to a public hearing at the select board level.
Yeah.
Because it's not a zoning ordinance
That's
per
what I
se.
think,
It would
yeah.
just be a historic preservation ordinance at that time.
And that historic preservation ordinance would likely have a demolition clause.
Within it.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Please, thanks.
Okay, yeah. If you had an overall plan, demolition would probably be part of it, as opposed to what we're talking about is only a demolition review process.
Right.
And one thing I wanted to say about that is that Judy and the committee, we looked at a whole bunch of towns in Maine. We looked at all of their plans, and really none of them, really fit Camden, if you know what I mean. I mean, they had ideas, but,
unique about
this would
Camden?
work and wouldn't work. Well, I think mostly we were thinking demolition delay at the time, or demolition, approval process. And in that process, what we were most interested in was just that they came for a review, that some board, some commission, somebody reviewed it, just to say that, yes, that building is important to the streetscape, or no, it's okay if that building weren't there. So at the time, we were looking mostly at demolition issues. And I don't know, I think in Camden, I think we just want to be open and fair and not be too restrictive. I think people have done a pretty good job in Camden. And so many of those plans were very, very specific. And
What ends up happening is a lot of times property owners, value the historic property and the neighborhood that they're in, so they don't make those changes. It's when that one change happens that the town is in uproar because this building that's been there forever, all of a sudden overnight went away. And even the demolition delay ordinance that we were looking at last year would allow that building to go away. It would have just made someone wait 15 months before that building went away. But they could wait that
Right,
out.
I mean, that was
They could just wait it out, and then all of a sudden the building goes away.
that's what you were concerned about.
Under historic preservation ordinance, there's a demolition piece, there's a process, and you've got to, it's not as easy for that building to go.
Right, and then the prospective purchaser is aware of that,
Yeah.
the existence of that, and so
Yeah.
they come to the, knowing that's part of the process.
What if the building is not listed as a historic building, but still historic?
That's a good question. Are you talking about any building that's historic in town? Yeah, I would not recommend the town going down that road at all.
What makes a building historic? It may seem like a really silly
Well,
question.
I
but-
think,
Generally, it's 50 years old or older, and then it has to go through a process at the state to review it, whether or not there's trailer parks out in California that are on the National Register.
I think what we want to protect is the village character. And I think what's important is what is right in the village area. I would love to save every farmhouse that's 100
Right.
years old, but I don't think that's going to work
And
here.
I don't think it'd pass.
I
The
think-
village, you mean not downtown, but the traditional village?
Right. The major
Yeah.
input roads,
Talking Union, Elm.
But are you also talking like Pearl Street?
Yeah,
and-
Mechanic, Pearls, some.
What I would
we could decide which ones
Right.
we wanted.
But
I
you're
mean,
talking about
I mean,
sort of that general, what we consider that chunk of residential village.
On the face, right off the bat, what I would recommend until some of these studies have already been completed and something has been listed on the National Register, is that we focus on, just right off the bat, focus on those that are historic districts and landmark properties in town. And then from there,
Or the ones that are currently being considered for
Yeah.
historic districts, like 2 streets we have.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I guess my concern is if we start regulating it under it, and then the state comes back and say, actually, because there's been so many changes over time, or just it doesn't qualify, I don't want to include those in a historic review if the state comes back and says, well, it doesn't qualify as a historic district. I mean, that's my only, I hear what you're saying. It'd be good to be able to get that moving, maybe.
Right.
But certainly a certified local government ordinance would enable us to get the funds from the state to be proactive and doing historic surveys to see if we should expand some of these districts or add districts. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So, if you create a historic district, then does every building in that district then become subject to the requirements of that district?
Generally, yes, and some buildings are contributing, and that's what will happen in a new survey. In essence, some are contributing to the historic district, and some are not contributing to the historic district.
So how
some
does
of the
that-
more
yeah.
recent.
So
what's that?
say just hypothetically, right, Mechanic Street became a historic district, right? There are some houses on Mechanic Street that are very authentic and lovely, and there's a variety of stuff there, right? There are some houses that don't really have any historic value per se. How does everybody up on Mechanic Street then become subject to?
Likely the
certain
state
set
would
of
come in a place like that and not say that this can be a district.
Oh, because of.
Because there's
Or
such
there's not
a
enough.
mix.
Likely, but
Okay.
I think mechanic's probably not a good example.
Yeah.
Okay, but
I thought it was a good example to bring up to.
Pearl is probably certain sections of Pearl are probably a better example.
so there you go. So I live on Pearl Street. So
Uh-huh.
so I'm interested in this, right? So I'm doing something on a budget, right? I want to be as authentic as possible, right? But then if that all becomes a historic district, does that start putting limitations on what I can do with my house?
Yes, on the exterior of your house, it would, should the town move forward on adopting that
So
ordinance.
when I bought my house had vinyl siding on, right, which is not my favourite siding, right? But
Mhm.
I added on to my house and I put vinyl siding on the addition because it matched what was there, and it was the most cost-effective way of doing that, right? There's nothing historic about vinyl siding, but
Well, why you'd have a review, that's why you would go.
So my question then is, if that was a historic district, would I then have to come before the historic review board and it would determine what kind of siding I could put on my house?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Though, if you had that condition where you had vinyl siding on your building, I ran into this a
That would
lot
be the
already,
argument I'd make
and you were
for that
doing an
is,
addition, likely the Historic Preservation Commission that would be reviewing that would say, okay, go ahead.
Could
Likely.
I chime in, please? I'm Judy McGurk, and I'm on the Historic Resources Committee. If you have vinyl siding on your house, you would be a non-contributing building because that's not historic. And my understanding from the towns that have these ordinances that I've studied, they never say you absolutely 100% can't do something. But you go through a review process, you're encouraged to keep the building historic, you're encouraged to do with your windows and your siding and your roof and everything else to keep it the historic look on the outside only. And usually if you're a district, not an individual building that's on the National Register, if you're a district, they only care about the front. They don't care about the back and the side and, so, but you would be a non-contributing building and if Pearl Street became a historic district.
We're
because
taking
of
up as far as your building and including yours.
It guts me that I put vinyl siding on in the first place. I always swore I wouldn't, so there you go.
Say, within the Historic Preservation Ordinance,
A long time ago.
within the ordinance, there are review criteria, right? Just like you have review criteria. There are review criteria in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And if you're going to be a CLG type of Historic Preservation Ordinance or Commission, then you have to use certified local government. Then you have to use the Secretary of the Interior standards and treatment for historic properties, standards for rehab of properties. So if that commission reviews that and someone comes in there to review, because they want to change the siding from clapboard siding to vinyl, and that commission is reviewing those standards if we're using those Secretary of the Interior standards, you cannot put vinyl siding on your house.
If you want to remain in the historic district. I mean, is that true? If you make those kinds of changes, I mean, if you're a standalone building and you're already on the National Register and you make those kind of changes, you're just kicked off to the National Register.
Well, but if we have an ordinance, we wouldn't let you put the vinyl
Does
siding.
anybody really do that? I mean, I'm not aware of any town that just says absolutely 100% you cannot.
Yeah. You can't use the standard, the CLG ordinance that are approved by SHPO and use those evaluation standards to allow someone to go from clapboard to vinyl.
You can't allow someone to opt out, essentially, of being in a historic district.
I don't know that that's true.
They can put it up on the back.
It is.
I've been working on those standards for a long time. And that's the difference. I mean, do we want to go the full CLG kind of ordinance, or do we want to go more of a design review kind of ordinance?
Right.
And
design
that's a little
review
different.
is start.
The design review gives the commission a little more leeway to flexibility.
Maybe you could be a contributing.
Because there are differences. I mean, if you want to go that CLG type of route, which I think that's the best way to protect a town's character and the history in a town, is that way.
Well, then, and my personal opinion would be to do that in the downtown area, not necessarily the residential areas. But,
I hate to see the residential areas shortchanged.
I mean, and that's the.
Everything we do in here or other things I work on is to benefit the downtown, but I think it's the neighborhoods and the residential area, first of all, that overall has some better characteristics than downtown. I don't think downtown is startlingly beautiful, but I wish we wouldn't always have to take second seat as a residential district. They're important.
That's really hard to pass, though. I mean, we tried doing it. I can't remember the year anymore. Was it 2003, 2013, something? You
never got to pass the select board.
Right. Well, because the building owners didn't want it to go any farther.
I mean, I get that. I think you have a select board, and I think people are more cognizant about these kinds of things now, and that character and history matter in this town. I just think that I mean, people come here for a certain reason. They buy homes in certain areas for a certain reason, and it's never been. I think you have a select board, and maybe shouldn't be speaking for Mark, but I think you have a select board that is more apt to listen to recommendations of certain committees and send things to voters, because I think this select board, I think they just value what voters say, and the only way to do that is by putting things to the voters.
And that's the hard part. I mean,
It is the hard part. I mean, I think you always have, 30 or 40% on either side of any issue, and you got the other percentage in the middle. They're the swing. And
The designation and the funds that can come from the feds because of it, can that be spent on renovations for private buildings? Because the opposition Judy mentioned were from building owners who maybe had a huge slate roof.
Exactly.
For them to replace that would be tens and tens of thousands of dollars, and they weren't willing to have the town tell them that they had to spend that.
I get that. I get that. I get that.
That's kind of where I'm at. I'm really, really supportive of maintaining the historic fabric of this town in as intact a state as we can, because once it's gone forever. And Camden's a beautiful place, but at the same time, I think it's got to be workable and it's got to be manageable. And if it suddenly starts being unaffordable, I mean, and so part of me wonders, how do you best explain what you want to do? And can you find a way of creating an ordinance which is explainable, that we can all understand and doesn't trample on individuals' ability to afford to keep their properties? going, right?
I like to think a design review ordinance is probably the better way to go because it's gives the board or that design review committee a little more latitude than the strict construction of the Secretary of the Interior standards.
It's our historic pipes.
It is.
They're hungry.
Sounds like, I mean, it sounds like,
my stomach growling.
sounds like Richard's supportive of something, Ethan is, Rosie is, if it doesn't negatively or financially really suck it to someone.
I think you're not going to get it voted through if you haven't really addressed that
Yep.
issue, and I want to see it go through. That's
Jeff, Mark, where you guys at on that?
We've been working on this for years now, so I'm just happy you guys are back in. Let's draft something up.
All right.
Keep it simple in the beginning, and we'll keep working on it.
We'll keep working on it. We'll keep working.
Well, I will take something to the,
we haven't heard from.
we haven't heard from you. No, I think I do. I always want to hear from Mark.
Well, I think it's a tricky situation, and, you know, on one hand, I mean, you hate to see these historic properties torn down with contemporary buildings built. But then you also hate to take away property owners' rights on what they can do with their property. And so I don't know where I stand on it.
I understand.
just-
I understand. So I'm going to go to the select board first meeting in January likely because it's just the timing that I need. If they just say, Jeremy, because of all this, go demolition review only, then I can nail that out for June. I mean, we have to have things finalized by March, but I think we can get there. If they say, yeah, go move forward on a historic preservation ordinance or design review for historic properties, likely, depending on where they direct me, it may not be doable for June. And they may want to send it to, because so many people may have issues or concerns about it, November 2020 might be that's going to be a big election. So a lot of people will come and vote. Hopefully.
All right, before we get into politics.
Okay.
is that
Well, thank you for your interest and your time.
Thank you for hanging
helpful?
in there
Thank you
with
for coming
us.
and talking to us.
And I'll come to you guys in January.
We are done, aren't we?
She might just be bribing us.
No, we're right on the time right here.
Sure.
They told me half. No, there's no way. There's no way.
Rum cake's half hour.
I don't even like. Did I say that out loud?
Is the meeting finished, or are you just feeding us so that we've got energy to keep going?
We just go into a workshop now, so I think
Going
we
into a
can close.
workshop?
Yes.
That was workshop, what we just had, wasn't it?
So cold, mate.
Table is workshop, can't we?
I don't know, it doesn't look like it. I was hoping it doesn't.
I mean, I had to turn
Except
up my
that
knife
rum
and
cake.
My stomach is growling so bad.
Chow that.
Going to be attending the meeting on the 23rd of January.
Yep.
To do a daycare.
Yeah. Pass that along. Yep.
I think your best contact is Jeremy. Have you spoken with him yet?
Jeannie.
Okay.
Motion to
Voters as written.
I make a motion to move this to the voters as written.
No, I'm sorry, public hearing.
No, you haven't turned it on. Are you ready?
Move to public.
Come on, do it.
On
Oh,
January 9th. January 9th. When the first, about the second Thursday.
Okay.
The second Thursday in January. Of 2020. Okay?
great.
We're gonna make a motion.
Yeah. So I make a motion.
Second.
No.
We're trying to. Okay, I make a motion that we pass these revisions as written to forward to the select board meeting on
Public hearing.
Oh, for the
the
public
public
hearing.
hearing on the second Thursday in January.
Strong second.
A strong second from Ethan. All those in favour? Aye. And a resounding aye, 5-0.
Thank you.
Maybe adjourn.
Can we,
That's it. Okay, good.
okay, make a motion to end the meeting. Second. All right,
Third.
all in favour? Okay.
Good cake this year, Jeannie.
Yeah, it was great.
Very good.
you
Thank you,
very
Jeannie.
Thank you so much.
There's more.
Thank you for everything during the year, too.
Tempting, man.
She's good. She keeps this
Second
going.
Sorry in town? Where's he at for your cake?
You must know.